Welcome to a deep dive into, well, a topic that feels a bit like science fiction, doesn't it? But it's becoming very real very fast. We're talking about the potential threat quantum computing poses to Bitcoin's fundamental security. You've shared some really insightful source material with us. It's a strategic analysis, really digging into Bitcoin's cryptographic weaknesses, looking at, when quantum computers might actually be powerful enough to matter, and exploring potential solutions.
Yeah, and what's fascinating, or maybe a bit scary, is how quickly this future threat seems to be heading towards our present. So our goal today is to really unpack these sources for you, help you understand the specific ways an attack could happen, get a handle on the huge financial risk involved, and look at the really complex path Bitcoin faces if it needs to upgrade its core protocol to stay secure.
Okay, let's get into it then, because this isn't just some theoretical hack in a lab. We're talking about something that could potentially reshape the entire digital currency landscape. It's a massive challenge, especially for a decentralized network like Bitcoin.
So where do we start? Let's begin with understanding the quantum arsenal, right? The specific algorithms that actually pose the threat. Our sources highlighted two main ones. First up, the most direct and honestly maybe the most catastrophic threat, Shor's algorithm.
Right. Shor's algorithm. Peter Shor developed it way back in '94. It's famous for being able to find the prime factors of large numbers. But the key thing for Bitcoin, the really critical part, is that it can also efficiently solve something called the discrete logarithm problem on elliptic curves.
And that matters. Why? Specifically for Bitcoin.
Right.
Where does that hit its security model?
Well, Bitcoin's security for signing transactions relies heavily on the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm, ECDSA. The entire model assumes it's practically impossible for a regular computer to figure out your private key just by looking at your public key. Okay, but here's the big question then. What happens when that core assumption gets completely shattered by a powerful quantum computer?
Exactly. That's the crux of it. A sufficiently powerful quantum computer running Shor's could theoretically take a public key, which, remember, is often public information on the blockchain, and work backwards to find the private key that controls the funds.
And the impact there is
Yeah.
direct theft, right?
Direct and devastating theft, yeah.
Yeah.
An attacker could forge your digital signature, authorize transactions you never approved, and just steal all the Bitcoin associated with that key. This is the most severe, the most immediate quantum risk, and it's what's really driving the urgent need to look at quantum-resistant solutions.
Okay, so Shor's is the nightmare scenario for individual funds. But the sources also mentioned Grover's algorithm. How does that one fit in? Is it the same kind of threat?
Grover's is a bit more subtle, yeah. It offers what's called a quadratic speedup for unstructured search problems. So it doesn't outright break a hash function like SHA-256 in the way Shor's breaks ECDSA, but it makes finding a specific output much, much faster.
Right. And in Bitcoin's world, that directly impacts proof-of-work mining, doesn't it? Miners are essentially doing a massive search for specific hash, so Grover's would speed that search up significantly. The sources said it effectively cuts SHA-256's security from 256 bits down to, like, 128 bits.
That's the theoretical impact, yes. So while it's not the same immediate steal your funds threat as Shor's, it threatens the mining process and network consensus. A miner with a powerful quantum computer running Grover's would have a huge advantage. This could potentially lead to mining power becoming much more centralized. Maybe even raise the risk of a 51% attack, although, the current Bitcoin mining network is incredibly powerful. So perhaps an oligopoly, a few dominant quantum miners, is a more likely scenario initially than a complete network takeover.
Okay, so we have these two quantum algorithms posing different kinds of threats. But a huge challenge, as our sources point out, is just figuring out when. When will a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, a CRQC, actually exist? The timelines seem to be all over the map.
They really are. It creates a massive strategic headache. Some aggressive predictions, especially looking at specific Bitcoin vulnerabilities, suggest it could be as soon as 3 years. Others estimate 5 to 8 years for breaking ECDSA, which might need around, say, 2,500 stable logical qubits.
And it's interesting to see how different groups are reacting. We've got government mandates like CNSA 2.0 and DHS directives pushing hard for post-quantum cryptography, PQC, migration. They're setting deadlines like 2025 to 2035 for critical national security systems. They're clearly taking a very risk-averse approach.
Definitely. But then you look at, say, Probabilistic estimates from NIST in 2024, they give maybe a 17-34% chance of breaking RSA 2048, which is roughly comparable to ECDSA by 2034, and maybe a 79% chance by 2044. Many experts, when pushed, still point towards 20 or even 30 years before we see quantum computers that could truly break SHA 256 or ECDSA across the board.
So what does this huge variance mean for Bitcoin? It sounds like a classic damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario for the developers.
It really is. Act too soon based on the aggressive timelines, and you risk pouring immense resources into complex upgrades for a threat that might still be decades away. You'd face accusations of, overreach or unnecessary disruption. But if you wait for the conservative estimates, and they turn out to be wrong, well, the network could be catastrophically vulnerable when Q-Day actually arrives.
So the prudent path isn't necessarily trying to guess the exact date.
Probably not. Given the potentially existential nature of the threat, the sources argue the best strategy is risk management. That means planning based on the earliest credible timelines, maybe the 3 to 8 year window, and focusing on building what's called crypto agility into the Bitcoin protocol itself, shifting from prediction to preparation.
And there's that Q-Day prize launching in 2025, offering 1 Bitcoin to whoever breaks Bitcoin's ECC first with a quantum computer. That puts a real-world practical test out there.
Yeah, it's a way to ground these timelines in actual demonstrated capability, not just projections.
Okay, let's pivot from when to where. Where exactly is Bitcoin vulnerable? Our sources dive into the specific attack surfaces. It seems to depend a lot on the type of Bitcoin address.
That's absolutely key. Bitcoin's architecture relies on 2 main cryptographic pillars. First, ECDSA for signatures, which we discussed, vulnerable to Shors. That's the big one for fund security. Second, the SHA 256 hash function, used everywhere, proof of work, generating addresses, transaction integrity. That's vulnerable to Grovers, mainly impacting mining.
But the risk isn't uniform across all Bitcoin. The sources talk about this legacy debt. What does that refer to?
It refers to older address types that carry a significant portion of Bitcoin's quantum risk. First, you have P2P, pay to public key. These are from the very early days, like 2009. With P2PK, the full public key is always visible right there on the blockchain.
Which means they're basically sitting ducks for a long-range quantum attack, right?
An attacker could target them anytime, now or in the future, once they have a CRQC. Precisely. They're a permanent honeypot. Estimates suggest around 1.9 million Bitcoin, many in those old Satoshi-era wallets, are locked in these highly vulnerable P2PK addresses. Then came P2PKH, pay-to-public key hash, dominant after 2010. These are a bit better initially. The public key isn't exposed until you actually spend from the address.
But the catch is, if you ever spend from it, the public key gets revealed. And if you reuse that address afterwards,
then it becomes just as vulnerable to a long-range attack as P2PK. And address reuse was unfortunately quite common. Sources estimate maybe 4 million BTC are sitting in reused P2PKH addresses, also vulnerable long-term.
So together, P2PK and reused P2PKH, that's nearly 6 million Bitcoin, around 28% of the total possible supply.
Yeah, somewhere around 5.9 million BTC. At today's prices, that's well over $400 billion, maybe closer to $500 billion at risk. This isn't just a theoretical risk. It's a massive systemic vulnerability that could seriously shake market confidence if exploited.
And it's not just the old addresses. The sources were clear that even newer formats like SegWit and Taproot aren't inherently quantum-proof. They have their own issues.
That's right. SegWit addresses like P2W-PKH and P2WSH still reveal the public key. It happens in the witness data when you spend a UTXO, an unspent transaction output. This makes them vulnerable to what's called a short-range attack, an attack that needs to happen quickly while the transaction is visible but unconfirmed, sitting in the mempool.
Okay, and Taproot, Bitcoin's latest big upgrade, P2TR. How does that fare?
Taproot's interesting because, by design, it often involves revealing public key information even when an address is just funded, not just when skent from. This means many Taproot uses are vulnerable to a long-range attack right from the start, similar to those old P2PK addresses. And that's significant because Taproot is being used for more and more things, including Layer 2 solutions like Lightning Network and newer protocols like Ordinals. So it expands the attack surface into the active, modern parts of the ecosystem.
So if almost all address types have some vulnerability, what's the most universal, immediate threat we need to worry about?
It's probably that short-range or mempool attack, because that affects all current Bitcoin address types when they're actively used. Think about it. You broadcast any standard transaction today, Your public key becomes visible in the mempool, the waiting area for transactions. A fast quantum attacker could potentially monitor the mempool, grab your public key, derive your private key using Shor's within the block confirmation time, typically 10 minutes, maybe up to an hour, and then quickly broadcast their own transaction spending your coins, probably with a higher fee to get mined first.
Wow. So even if you're careful and never reuse addresses, just the act of spending makes you vulnerable in that short window.
Correct. Which really underscores why user-level best practices alone aren't enough. You absolutely need a protocol-level upgrade to quantum-resistant digital signatures to counter this mempool threat.
And there's another angle too, right? This harvest now, decrypt later idea.
Yes, that's a more patient, insidious threat. An adversary, maybe a state-level actor, could be doing this right now, systematically scanning the entire Bitcoin blockchain, recording every exposed public key they find, P2PK, reused P2PKH, revealed taproot keys, any key revealed during a transaction, and just storing this massive database.
And then they just wait.
They wait until they have a working CRQC, maybe years or decades from now. Then they run Shor's algorithm against their harvested database, derive the private keys, and try to sweep all the funds from those addresses simultaneously. So this isn't just a future problem to think about later. The harvesting could be happening today, which has a whole other layer of urgency, especially for getting funds out of those perpetually vulnerable address types.
Okay, that paints a pretty concerning picture of the vulnerabilities. Let's talk solutions. What are the defenses being developed? The sources point heavily towards post-quantum cryptography, PQC.
Yes. PQC is the main line of defense. There is a huge global effort, led primarily by the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, to develop and standardize new cryptographic algorithms that are resistant to attack by both classical and quantum computers.
This NIST process has been running for a while, hasn't it?
Since 2016. It's been a multi-year, multi-round competition, incredibly rigorous. Cryptographers from all over the world have been scrutinizing submissions. The goal is to have a portfolio of standardized algorithms based on different mathematical problems, things like lattices, hashes, codes. This diversity is important, so if a weakness is found in one type, hopefully the others still hold.
And NIST has started finalizing some of these.
They have. They announced the first winners back in July 2022. Then in August 2024, they published the first 3 final standards: ML-Chem for key encapsulation, and 2 digital signature algorithms, MLDSA, also known as crystals dilithium, and SLHDSA, also known as SFIN-CS plus Methcos. And just recently, March 2025, they selected another algorithm, HQC, for standardization.
So for Bitcoin, we're mainly interested in those digital signature algorithms, right? Dilithium and SYN-CS plus ELEPS, and maybe others coming down the pipe.
Exactly. Dilithium, now standardized as FIPS 204, is a strong candidate. It seems to offer a decent balance between security and performance, although the signatures are significantly larger than Bitcoin's current ECDSA signatures. There's also Falcon, FNDSA. A graph standard is expected maybe late 2024. It's really attractive because it promises much smaller signature sizes, which would be great for keeping Bitcoin transaction fees down and preventing the blockchain from bloating too much. But it's also considered more complex to implement securely. And SysFin-CS plus N, the other finalized one, it's based on different security assumptions, which is good for diversity, but its signatures are very large. Probably too large for practical use in every single Bitcoin transaction.
So it sounds like picking one isn't straightforward. Can Bitcoin just, swap out ECDSA and drop in, say, dilithium?
Yeah.
Seems like there are major trade-offs.
Huge trade-offs. It's definitely not a simple swap. The biggest immediate issue is size. PQC signatures, whether dilithium or Falcon or SFIN-CS plus R, are many times larger than the ECDSA signatures Bitcoin uses now.
And larger signatures mean what exactly for the network?
Higher transaction fees for users, because fees are related to data size. More storage space needed for the blockchain itself, which makes running a full node harder and more expensive, potentially hurting decentralization. And it likely means lower network throughput simply because fewer transactions will fit into each block if the signatures take up more space.
Are there performance impacts too? Like, are they slower to create or check?
Yes, there's increased computational overhead as well for both generating and verifying these new signatures. This could create bottlenecks, especially during peak transaction times. And maybe the biggest hurdle is trust. These PQC algorithms are relatively new. They haven't had the decades of real-world deployment and intense cryptanalysis that ECDSA has survived. Getting the very conservative Bitcoin development community fully comfortable will take time and evidence.
So this isn't just a simple security patch. It sounds like it forces a fundamental reevaluation of that core Bitcoin trilemma. security, decentralization, and scalability. You might have to sacrifice some of one to get quantum security.
That's exactly right. It's a systemic redesign that touches everything, which leads to this concept our sources emphasize: crypto agility.
Crypto agility, what does that mean in Bitcoin's context?
It's basically the idea that the system should be designed to switch between different cryptographic algorithms relatively easily without major disruption. It's a design philosophy, really. It acknowledges that no single algorithm, not even these new PQC ones, can be considered secure forever. New attacks get discovered.
So avoid the trap of thinking this is a one-time fix. Instead of just replacing ECDSA with dilithium, design the protocol so it can support multiple signature types, maybe versioning, making future upgrades less painful.
Precisely. It's about building adaptability into Bitcoin's cryptographic foundations, a much more profound change than just swapping one algorithm out.
Okay, so given that need for agility and the challenges, what concrete steps or proposals are actually being discussed? Are there BIPs, Bitcoin improvement proposals, related to this?
There are conceptual proposals being floated and discussed, yes. One mentioned in the sources is BIP 360 or something like it, maybe called pay-to-quantum resistant hash, P2QRH. The basic idea is to introduce a new type of transaction output that uses one of the NIST standardized signature schemes, like Falcon or dilithium. Crucially, the aim would be to implement this via a soft fork, a backward-compatible upgrade, primarily to address that urgent short-range mempool attack threat first.
And what about that huge legacy debt? Those nearly 6 million Bitcoin in old, vulnerable addresses. Is there anything being discussed for that?
That's where this other conceptual idea comes in, sometimes called QRMP, Quantum Resistant Address Migration Protocol. It's specifically aimed at tackling that legacy risk. The concept involves identifying those vulnerable addresses, somehow allowing users to voluntarily burn the BTC in them, send them to an unspendable address, and then, through some mechanism, be issued an equivalent amount of new quantum-resistant coins or tokens on the main chain.
Wow. Okay, that sounds incredibly complex and potentially really controversial.
Yeah.
Burning coins, issuing new ones.
Highly complex and extremely controversial.
Yes.
While it directly addresses the risk of those legacy coins being stolen en masse someday, it raises enormous technical, governance, and ethical questions. Think about property rights, censorship resistance. Could it be seen as confiscation? It would almost certainly require a hard fork, a non-backward compatible change, which carries that huge risk of splitting the Bitcoin network. There's absolutely no consensus on anything like QRAMP right now.
It really highlights the massive technical and social challenges here.
Absolutely. Bitcoin's decentralization is its strength, but for upgrades like this, it's also its biggest hurdle. Achieving consensus across developers, miners, node operators, businesses, individual users. It's a slow, deliberate, often contentious process. This is a liability when facing what might be an urgent ticking clock. And you have the tragedy of the commons problem. Everyone benefits if the network is secured, but individual users or businesses bear the immediate costs and hassles of upgrading.
And that choice of upgrade mechanism, soft fork versus hard fork, is critical.
Hugely critical. Soft forks are generally preferred because nodes that don't upgrade can still participate in the network. Hard forks force everyone to upgrade or be left behind on a minority chain. Any proposal seen as fundamentally altering Bitcoin's rules, especially around coin ownership or supply, like burning or migrating funds in a mandatory way, would almost certainly need a hard fork and would likely be incredibly divisive, potentially leading to a permanent split.
And even if the technical side gets solved and consensus is somehow reached on an upgrade path, just getting users to actually migrate their funds sounds like a monumental task.
It's another massive hurdle. The entire ecosystem needs to adapt. Wallets, exchanges, payment processors, hardware wallets, they all need to support the new quantum-resistant address types and transaction formats. That requires huge coordination. You'd need multi-year education campaigns to get users to understand why migration is necessary and how to do it safely. And the practicalities, the cost of transaction fees to move potentially billions of dollars worth of BTC could be significant, even prohibitive for smaller holders.
Plus, there's that really difficult problem of lost coins. What happens to the Bitcoin in vulnerable addresses where the private keys are lost forever? Nobody can migrate them.
That's right. A substantial portion of that 5.9 million BTC legacy debt is likely inaccessible. Lost keys, forgotten passwords, deceased owners. Those funds will remain on the blockchain in vulnerable addresses, potentially forever, a permanent honeypot. Forcing a migration deadline could cause users with recoverable keys to panic sell, or worse, make mistakes and lose their funds trying to migrate. The idea of somehow burning or neutralizing these truly lost coins, while potentially beneficial for removing long-term risk, remains the most ethically fraught and divisive part of the whole discussion. There's just no easy answer there.
So wrapping this all up, what's the main takeaway from the source material? What's the bottom line?
I think the clearest message is that waiting around, trying to perfectly predict Q day before acting, is effectively waiting for failure. Given the stakes, a purely reactive stance is unacceptably risky for Bitcoin.
Right, so the strategic recommendations lean heavily towards proactive preparation.
Definitely. Things like start the planning and development for quantum resistance now. Prioritize integrating quantum-resistant signatures, likely via a soft fork, to handle the immediate mempool threat. Develop a clear, phased migration strategy, even if mandatory migration is off the table. Embrace that crypto agility in the protocol design for future-proofing. And of course, continuously monitor the actual progress in quantum computing.
It leaves us with a lot to think about.
It really does. And maybe a final question for you, the listener, to ponder. When you consider all this, the technological complexity, the economic stakes, Bitcoin's unique decentralized governance, what do you see as the single biggest hurdle Bitcoin faces in navigating this transition to a quantum-resistant future? Is it technical, social, economic, governance? Why?
It's certainly a journey that's going to demand incredible foresight, collaboration, and a long-term vision. Unlike almost anything Bitcoin has faced before, it's about ensuring its security and value proposition can survive in a radically different technological landscape.